You wake up every morning and put on a mask. Not a literal one, but something far more insidious. You smile when you want to scream. You nod when you want to refuse. You pretend to care about things that make your soul feel hollow. And here's the worst part. You've been wearing this mask for so long that you've started to believe it's your actual face. You tell yourself stories to justify why you stay in that job that's slowly killing your spirit. Why you remain in relationships that feel like performance art. Why you keep chasing goals that someone else planted in your mind years ago. Deep down, in those quiet moments before sleep when your defenses are down, you feel it. That gnawing sensation that something is profoundly wrong, that you're living at a distance from yourself, watching your own life like a movie where someone else is playing your role. You feel like a fraud, but you can't quite name why. The anxiety sits in your chest, unexplained and constant. You're exhausted from maintaining a version of yourself that requires so much effort to sustain. And the most terrifying part? You've become so good at this self-deception that you can't tell anymore where the real you ends and the performance begins. What if I told you that this feeling has a name, and that one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century spent his life dissecting exactly this kind of living? Jean-Paul Sartre called it bad faith, and he believed it was the most common form of self-betrayal that humans engage in. Today we're going to explore 7 unmistakable signs that you're living in bad faith. And more importantly, why recognizing them might be the first step toward reclaiming the authentic life you've been desperately searching for. The first sign that you're living in bad faith is when you constantly blame external circumstances for your choices, while secretly knowing you could choose differently. Listen carefully, because this one cuts deep. You tell yourself you had no choice but to take that corporate job, that you had to abandon your creative pursuits because of bills and responsibilities, that you must stay in your hometown because of family obligations. And yes, these are real constraints. Sartre never denied that we live in situations with real limitations. But here's where bad faith creeps in. You use these constraints as a total excuse, as if they completely eliminate your freedom, when deep inside you know they don't. You know, there are other options, perhaps difficult ones, perhaps scary ones, but options nonetheless. The person in bad faith transforms situational difficulty into absolute impossibility. And they say I have no choice when what they really mean is I'm afraid of the consequences of choosing differently. Sartre witnessed this constantly in occupied Paris. People who collaborated with the Nazis claiming they had no choice, when in fact they did. They simply feared the consequences of resistance. The anxiety you feel isn't about the situation itself. It's about the gap between your claimed helplessness and your suppressed awareness of your actual freedom. You're lying to yourself, and part of you knows it. That's why it feels so uncomfortable. You've made yourself into a thing, an object pushed around by circumstances, rather than acknowledging that you're a consciousness that always has the terrible burden of choice. Even choosing to do nothing is a choice, and you're responsible for it. The waiter in Sartre's famous example from being in nothingness performs the role of waiter so completely, so mechanically, that he tries to become the waiter, to lose himself in the social role and escape his freedom. But he can never fully succeed because consciousness can never be reduced to a fixed identity. You feel the tension because you're trying to live as if you were a thing with a predetermined nature, when you're actually a free being who must constantly create yourself through choices. And that brings us to something crucial. Bad faith isn't just about lying to others. It's about the lies you tell yourself, the stories you construct to avoid the vertigo of freedom. The second sign is when you define yourself entirely by social roles and become anxious when you have to exist outside of them. Think about this honestly. Who are you when you're not performing your job title, your relationship status, your parental role, your position in whatever hierarchy defines your worth? For many people living in bad faith, this question provokes genuine panic because they've invested their entire sense of self into these external definitions. You're a manager, a spouse, a parent, a provider, and these roles come with scripts, expectations, and defined behaviors that feel safe precisely because they tell you what to do. You don't have to face the dizzying responsibility of deciding who you are when the role tells you. But here's the trap. You start to believe you are the role, that your essence is defined by your function. Sartre would say you're treating yourself as being in itself rather than being for itself. You're trying to give yourself the solidity and permanence of an object when you're actually a consciousness that must perpetually create its own meaning. Watch what happens when the role gets disrupted. When you lose your job, when your kids leave home, when your relationship ends, you don't just feel sad or disappointed. You feel existentially annihilated because without the role, you don't know who you are. You've been hiding in the role, using it as a shelter from freedom. And the person living authentically understands that they occupy roles but are never reducible to them. They can be a teacher in the classroom, but they don't dissolve into teacherness. They maintain awareness that they're a free consciousness choosing to engage in teaching. The difference is subtle but monumental. One is performing a role while maintaining ironic distance from it, aware that they could always choose otherwise. The other is desperately trying to become the role, to achieve the impossible feat of transforming their fluid consciousness into a fixed essence. And you know which one you're doing. You know by how it feels. Does your role feel like clothes you're wearing or like a cage you're trapped in? Do you take it off when you go home, or does it define every moment of your existence? Are you comfortable with the gap between who you are and what you do? Or does that gap terrify you because you've built your entire identity on collapsing it? Before we continue, I want to pause here and speak directly to you. How many times have you felt that you're living a life that isn't really yours? That you're just following a script that other people wrote for you, and inside there's a silent scream asking to be who you really are? I know it hurts to admit this because it feels like you're failing, that you should be grateful for what you have, that it's selfish to want more. But I want you to know something. This feeling doesn't mean you're ungrateful or weak. It means you're alive, conscious, and there's a truth inside you asking to come out. And I'm sure it's not just you who feels this. Go to the comments now and write this: I'm living someone else's life. It might seem simple, but when you put it into words, something changes. And you know what happens? Another person watching this video, feeling completely alone with this weight, will read your comment and realize they're not alone. Your comment might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. So go ahead, without fear, without shame. We're in this search together. The third sign of bad faith is when you make decisions based on what you imagine others expect of you, then resent them for the choices you made. This is perhaps the most psychologically twisted aspect of bad faith because it involves a complex dance of self-deception. You choose your career because you imagine it will impress your parents or peers. You stay in a relationship because you imagine what people will think if you leave. You buy things, adopt opinions, curate a lifestyle based on an imagined audience whose approval you desperately seek. But here's the mechanism of bad faith at work. You tell yourself you have to do these things. That social pressure gives you no choice, when in fact you're the one choosing to prioritize others' imagined opinions over your own authentic desires. Then, and this is the cruel irony, you resent the very people whose approval you sought. You blame your parents for your career choice, your partner for your unhappiness, your friends for your lifestyle, when the truth is, you made these choices yourself. You gave away your freedom voluntarily, then pretended it was taken from you. Sartre's concept of the look, the gaze of the other, is crucial here. When another consciousness looks at you, you become aware of yourself as an object in their world, and this creates a profound anxiety. You're suddenly frozen into a thing being judged. The person in bad faith responds to this anxiety by trying to control how they appear, by crafting a self that will earn approval. But in doing so, they abandon their own freedom and then blame others for their self-imposed prison. The authentic response, according to Sartre, is to acknowledge this tension without trying to escape it. Yes, you exist for others and their gaze does affect you, but you remain free to choose how you respond. You can choose to value your own judgment over theirs. You can choose to disappoint them. You can choose to be misunderstood. But you have to own that choice and stop pretending they forced you into it. Every time you say, I had to because they would think, or I couldn't because people would judge, you're engaging in bad faith. You're transforming your own free choice into an external compulsion. And the resentment you feel is actually self-directed anger at your own cowardice that you're projecting onto others. The fourth sign is when you treat your past as if it completely determines your present and future, using it as an excuse for not changing. How often have you said or thought something like, that's just who I am, or I've always been this way, or I can't change because of what happened to me? This is bad faith in its purest form because it attempts to use your past to create a fixed essence, to escape the burden of freedom by claiming you're already determined. Yes, your past is real. The things that happened to you shaped you, gave you certain tendencies, created patterns. Sartre called this your facticity, the brute facts of your existence that you didn't choose. But here's what bad faith does. It takes facticity and transforms it into destiny. It uses what was to justify what must be. The person who had an abusive childhood tells themselves they're damaged beyond repair. The person who failed before tells themselves they're a failure by nature. The person who was betrayed tells themselves they can never trust again. In each case, they're taking a historical fact and turning it into an eternal essence, fleeing from the terrifying truth that at every moment they're free to respond to their past differently. Sartre's insight was radical. You're not the sum of your past experiences. You're the consciousness that interprets and responds to those experiences right now. Your past doesn't determine you. Your present choice about how to relate to your past determines you. The person living authentically acknowledges their past without being imprisoned by it. They say, yes, this happened to me, and now I must decide what it means and how I'll carry it forward. They maintain what Sartre called transcendence, the ability to perpetually surpass what they were toward what they choose to become. Every moment is a new opportunity to redefine yourself, and that's both exhilarating and terrifying. Bad faith emerges as a defense against that terror. It's easier to say I can't change because of my past than to face the disturbing truth that you're free to change at any moment and simply choosing not to. The weight you feel isn't the weight of your past, it's the weight of your present freedom that you're refusing to exercise. The fifth sign is when you convince yourself you'll live authentically later, after you've secured enough money, status, or stability. This is bad faith as procrastination, the lie that you can defer freedom until circumstances are perfect. You tell yourself you'll pursue your real passions after you retire. You'll be honest with people once you've achieved success. You'll live according to your values when you have financial security. But Sartre would ask, what makes you think you'll be capable of authenticity later if you're practicing self-deception now? What makes you think the authentic self you're suppressing will still be available after decades of ignoring it? This form of bad faith is particularly insidious because it feels responsible and mature. You're being practical, you're building a foundation, you're being realistic about the world. But underneath, you're making a deal with yourself that you'll probably never honor. You're using the future as an escape hatch from present responsibility. And here's what's really happening. You're treating your authentic self as something you possess that can be put on a shelf and retrieved later. When in fact, your authentic self isn't a thing you have, but a way of being that you either practice or lose. Every day you live inauthentically, you become more entrenched in bad faith. The neural pathways of self-deception strengthen. The authentic voice gets quieter. The gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be widens until you can barely remember there was ever a difference. Sartre was adamant that we can't escape our freedom by postponing it. You're free right now, in this moment, in these circumstances, with these limitations. The question isn't whether you'll be free someday, it's what you're doing with your freedom right now. The person in bad faith imagines a future liberated self while remaining enslaved in the present. The authentic person understands that freedom is now or never, that authenticity is a practice, not a destination. You don't arrive at authentic living, you choose it moment by moment, and every moment you defer it, you're choosing its opposite. And if you're starting to question your own choices and the freedom you carry, leave your like on this video so more people can discover Sartre's thought. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos about the philosophers who changed our way of seeing the world. The sixth sign is when you experience relief rather than distress when circumstances limit your options. Pay attention to this one because it reveals the deepest mechanism of bad faith. Most people claim they want freedom, but watch what happens when freedom is actually removed. When your boss makes a decision for you, when social convention dictates a clear path, when rules eliminate choice, do you feel constrained or secretly relieved? The person in bad faith feels relief because they've been handed an escape from responsibility. Now they can say I had no choice, and it's actually true. The burden has been lifted. They can be in bad faith without even having to lie to themselves because the external world has done the work for them. Sartre observed this phenomenon in multiple contexts, but it was most stark during the Nazi occupation. Some people who might have lived in moderate bad faith under normal circumstances embraced the occupation as a kind of liberation from freedom. The rules were clear, the choices were made, they could simply obey and dissolve into the collective. No more agonizing about what to do, no more responsibility for creating meaning, just follow orders. This isn't to say everyone who followed rules was in bad faith, but those who felt relief at having choices removed certainly were. Think about your own life. When do you feel that subtle sense of relief? When a relationship partner is controlling? When your job micromanages you? When social pressure makes a decision obvious? That relief is the sign that you're fleeing freedom, using external constraints as a refuge from the anxiety of choice. The authentic person feels constrained by limitations because they value their freedom and resent anything that restricts it. They chafe against unnecessary rules. They question authority that hasn't earned legitimacy. They push against social norms that don't serve them. They experience limitations as limitations, not as relief. And here's the deep truth Sartre understood. You can't be forced into authenticity. Removing constraints doesn't automatically make someone live authentically. It often just reveals their bad faith more clearly. Give someone absolute freedom and watch what they do with it. Many will immediately create new constraints, new rules, new authorities to submit to because they can't bear the weight of freedom. Authentic living isn't about having unlimited options. It's about owning your choices within whatever limitations exist, and that ownership feels heavy, not relieving. The seventh and final sign is when you feel profound discomfort with ambiguity and constantly need to categorize yourself and others into fixed identities. This is bad faith as a quest for certainty, the attempt to freeze the fluid reality of human existence into stable categories that eliminate the anxiety of becoming. You desperately want to know what kind of person you are, what category you fit into, what your personality type reveals about you, what your identity labels define about your essence. And you do the same to others. You need to quickly assess what kind of person they are to fit them into boxes that make them predictable and manageable. But human consciousness, according to Sartre, is fundamentally ambiguous. You're never simply anything because you're always in the process of becoming something through your choices. The moment you define yourself with certainty, you've engaged in bad faith because you've treated your consciousness as if it were a fixed object rather than an ongoing project. This doesn't mean you can't make generalizations about yourself or recognize patterns in your behavior. It means you can't use those patterns to escape responsibility for your next choice. The person in bad faith says, I'm an anxious person, so of course I can't take that risk. The authentic person says, I have a pattern of anxiety, and right now I'm choosing whether to follow that pattern or transcend it. The difference is everything. One has transformed a tendency into a destiny. The other maintains awareness of freedom within the pattern. Watch how you use identity labels. Do you use them descriptively to communicate patterns, or do you use them proscriptively to justify behaviors and limit possibilities? Do you say I'm introverted as shorthand for I tend to recharge through solitude, or as an excuse for I can't be social because it's against my nature? The first is authentic self-awareness, the second is bad faith. And this extends to how you perceive others. When someone behaves in a way that surprises you, do you get angry because they violated your category for them, or do you recognize that humans are free and therefore unpredictable? The person in bad faith needs others to stay in their assigned boxes because ambiguity is threatening. The authentic person accepts that everyone, including themselves, is perpetually unfinished, perpetually free to become otherwise. And yes, this is uncomfortable. It means you can never fully know yourself or others. It means certainty is impossible. It means you have to live with the anxiety of not knowing what you or anyone else will choose next. But that anxiety, Sartre argued, is the price of freedom, and trying to escape it through the false certainty of fixed identities is one of the most common and damaging forms of bad faith. Now that you've seen these 7 signs, you might be feeling something uncomfortable. Maybe recognition, maybe denial, maybe that particular anxiety that comes when you realize you've been lying to yourself, and that's exactly where Sartre would say you need to be. Not comfortable, not certain, but awake. Because bad faith is seductive precisely because it offers comfort and certainty. The comfortable lie that you're not really free, the certainty that you're just following your nature or your circumstances or other people's expectations. But the moment you recognize bad faith for what it is, you've already begun to transcend it. You can't unknow your freedom once you've truly seen it. Sartre believed that authenticity wasn't about achieving some perfect state of self-knowledge or moral purity. It was about maintaining a constant vigilance against the patterns of self-deception that we all fall into. Because freedom is genuinely difficult to bear. You'll probably never completely escape bad faith. Nobody does. But you can become more aware of when you're engaging in it, and that awareness itself is a form of freedom. The question isn't whether you've lived in bad faith. The question is what you're going to do now that you recognize it. Because here's what Sartre understood that makes his philosophy so powerful and so terrifying. Recognizing bad faith creates an obligation. Once you see that you've been living inauthentically, once you acknowledge that you're free and responsible, you can't go back to comfortable self-deception without now knowing that you're choosing it. The anxiety gets worse before it gets better because now you're not just living in bad faith, you're choosing bad faith while knowing it's bad faith. But that moment, that terrible moment of recognition, is also the moment when authentic living becomes possible. You can choose to own your freedom, to accept responsibility for your choices, to live without the comforting lies. It won't make life easier. Sartre never promised that. Authenticity is harder than bad faith. That's why most people avoid it. But it's also more real, more vital, more genuinely yours. And maybe that's what you've been searching for all along. Not comfort or certainty, but the feeling of actually living your own life rather than performing someone else's idea of what your life should be. If you made it this far, it's because something inside you is seeking answers that the world around you can't give. This restlessness you feel, this sensation that something more authentic is waiting for you, it's not weakness. It's the first sign that you're ready for real transformation. This channel exists exactly for people like you, who aren't satisfied with shallow answers and who have the courage to look inside even when it hurts. Here every week I bring new videos exploring the philosophers who can illuminate this path you're walking, always with the same depth and care you saw here. It's not about accumulating empty knowledge. It's about finding real tools to live with more freedom, authenticity, and purpose. Subscribing to the channel is a small act, but it can be the beginning of a journey that will completely change how you see yourself and your choices. And you don't have to do this alone. There's an entire community here in the comments, people who feel what you feel, who fight the same struggles. Click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's go together on this search for a life that's truly worth living. You deserve this clarity. You deserve this freedom.